jury summons in the mail. I had served on a jury once up here in Adams County. And since moving to Columbia, I had received a couple of notices that I was in the prospect pool. But this time I actually got the call. And for the next several days, I had the privilege of participating in the American justice system from the inside. Two words to focus on at first: privilege and system. And yes, I considered it a privilege, although my time as a juror was exhausting and stressful. There were clearly some people in my pool of 80 or so who were trying very hard to get out of jury duty. But I found the process unexpectedly ennobling. There we were, gathered by random selection in a large room, being winnowed out through questioning to find the dozen people best suited to sit in judgment of a fellow human being. I would have been happy to be sent home, but I wasn't resentful at being kept. Our case was, to my mind, particularly difficult. Here are the basic outlines. A married couple and their family friend go off for an overnight outing to a concert. When the couple's babysitter falls through at the last minute, the friend's husband is pressed into service to babysit the couple's 3 children, 2 teenage girls and a younger boy. The evening passes, and when the concert goers return the next day, nothing is reported. But a month later, one of the girls tells her mother that something inappropriate happened between herself and the babysitting husband. The husband denies that any such thing happened. The families break contact. The wheels of society get into motion. And 4 years later, criminal charges are filed. So there we sat. All we had to judge by was their testimony. No direct witnesses, no physical evidence, no police report. Nada. One person said the incident happened, the other person denied it altogether. The accuser had some corroborating witnesses, but they were after the fact, and none of their accounts matched up completely. So we were left to decide essentially who we believed. And once we reached the jury room, our search for justice began. But what do we mean by justice? This is a question that has bedeviled philosophers for millennia, and not one to be answered here. But in the personal experience of justice, abstract questions don't seem as important. Our group of disparate people had to determine what had happened, whether it was wrong, and if so, how wrong. When we use the word justice, we generally mean giving someone or something what they deserve. The common expression, to do justice, conveys that sense. Did my description of a meal do justice to it? Which is to say, did it cover it fully, give a complete and accurate account of how good or bad it was? Does a painting do justice to its subject? But in the legal arena, justice is a narrower and more restrictive thing with a lot less room for subjectivity. And that brings me to the second word I wanted to focus on: system. The legal version of justice is very much focused on process. Who's allowed to speak, what they're allowed to say, what kinds of things can and cannot be said. All these questions preoccupy the justice system, and they're intended to bleach out the subjectivity of the process as much as possible. That's why they call it a system. The goal is for everyone who goes through it to be subjected to the same rules and procedures. Uniformity of process will result in fair treatment, or so the idea goes. That's why the statue of Justice on top of the courthouses of America is always depicted wearing a blindfold. Justice isn't interested in who you are, only in your place in the process. That's a fine principle, but as we know, principles get muddy once we get down to the particulars of an individual case. That certainly happened in my situation. Our instructions were the ones given in every case to restrict ourselves to the evidence as presented and to engage in only fact-based discussion. But those instructions fell by the wayside from time to time. Jury members are human beings, and like all human beings, we couldn't help engaging in speculation about what really happened between those two, and what was behind the situation, why there wasn't any other evidence, and so forth. Then one of the other members of the jury would remind us that we were wandering off into forbidden territory, and the conversation usually got back on track. I say usually because ultimately we did not get on track. Human nature asserted itself in several ways, and not all of them were good. Arguments got personal. People stopped listening to each other. Legitimate differences of opinion were cast as the other person being stubborn or unreasonable. And in fact, people did become stubborn and unreasonable. As I said earlier, this was a tough case. It depended entirely on which person we believed. A majority of us thought that the conflicting testimony left enough room for reasonable doubt that we couldn't declare with certainty what had happened. And that meant a not guilty verdict. But one of our members believed the accuser completely. And believing the accuser means disbelieving the defendant. So she was a guilty vote. And I want to emphasize that this was not an irrational or illogical opinion. Once you accept the premise, this person is telling the truth, that person is not, you are drawn inexorably to that conclusion. And that's where we stuck as the hours went by. Now, anyone who's been around children will recognize the one great complaint that applies to all kinds of situations. It's the complaint for which there is no good answer. That's not fair. The reason there's no good answer to this complaint is that it's often true. Like it or not, we are often stuck in situations where we have to tolerate unfairness. The child's complaint at unfairness is painful to us because we know it's justified, and because we know it will not be the last time that the child has to confront it, and we don't know what to say. At times like that, I've heard parents say, "Life's not fair." But that seems too dismissive, almost cruel. It's the sort of thing someone says when they don't want to say the real reason. Johnny gets an extra turn on the swings because if we don't give it to him, he will bellow and yell, and everybody will look in our direction to see if I'm hitting him, and I just don't want to deal with that right now. That might be a more accurate explanation than life's not fair, but it's equally unsatisfying. And that's where we found ourselves in the jury room. Despite our disagreement, we shared one sense in common. Whatever we decided, someone was going to feel that they had been treated unfairly. Either a person would be convicted based on slender evidence, or an accuser would see their tormentor walk out with essentially no accountability. Maybe justice in the legal sense would have been done, but justice in the larger sense would not. As it turned out, neither outcome happened. Stuck in their fixed positions, the jurors drew farther and farther away from each other, eventually separating physically, until after several hours, the exasperated judge ruled that we could not reach a verdict and sent us home. So in the end, even justice in the legal sense did not take place. Our second principle of the UUA provides for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And I think it's a good idea for us to unpack that phrase. Justice, as I've been working with the term here, is a tough and elusive bird to catch a lot of times. And its achievement depends upon a lot where you're standing. What looks like justice to me may look like patent unfairness to you. That's why we rely on the aptly named justice system, because it's a system. And because it's a system, we at least have some belief that it will treat us impartially, however imperfect and clumsy that system might be. But justice is not the only virtue mentioned here, nor is it even the most important in some situations, I think. You remember the story of the Scarlet Letter. Roger Chillingworth, Hester Prynne's husband, is ostensibly in search of justice as he hounds poor Hester mercilessly to find out the identity of Pearl's father. But the missing element in his search is compassion. And of course, we all remember Javert from Les Mis, whose remorseless pursuit of justice blinded him to his own cruelty and led to disaster. When I think about those three values in the second principle, justice, equity, and compassion, sometimes I think of them as a pie chart with the sections for each quality varying according to the needs of the situation. Sometimes you need a lot of justice with not much room for compassion. Sometimes it's the other way around. And sometimes equity must take a larger share at the cost of the others. I happened to have a conversation with one of the attorneys in the case after it was all over, and he remarked that he wished there was some way the parties could find resolution outside the court system. But everyone had gotten so locked into their positions by now that he felt any such resolution was impossible. I'm afraid that's an all too common outcome in our search for justice. We harden our stances and we close off our options. The Unitarian Universalist Association has been among the leaders in movements such as restorative justice and reconciliation, which seek to go beyond legalistic definitions of justice and include elements of healing as they address injustice. These efforts are not a panacea, though. They bring their own issues and complications. When I think about restorative justice, I sometimes think about a bad habit of mine, which consists of going over and over in my mind the mistakes I have made and the wrongs I have done, even when there's nothing I can do to rectify them. Mean remarks I made as a teenager, rude behavior I engaged in when I was in college. There's a point at which one's direction in seeking justice needs to aim toward the future, not the past. I'm reminded of Isabel Wilkinson's metaphor from her book Caste, in which she writes about dealing with the historical repercussions of things like slavery and racism. She compares our social structure to a house that you have inherited or taken possession of. You didn't build the house with all its cracks and flaws, but you're going to have to live in it for a while. So you have to do the best you can to repair it, because you're the one who lives there now. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the language of reconciliation and confuse it with actual reconciliation itself. You may have noticed that a lot of Unitarian churches are now acknowledging the inhabitants of their town or region at the time of European settlement. So instead of saying that I am from Colombia, I might say that I am from the former lands of the Wazhasi or Osage. This linguistic formulation may give us the comfort that we are acknowledging past wrongs, but something seems lacking. I recently read an anecdote in which a minister made this point. Before stepping up to the lectern, he asked a parishioner for $20. He then held up the bill and announced, "I acknowledge the wrong that has been done in the taking of this money, and I regret the events that led to its taking." And then he said, "Oh, you want your money back." Acknowledgement without action is not justice. Next month, on the 18th Saturday of November, we will be holding a workshop on reconciliation and exploring what reconciliation means to each of us. Watch the newsletter for a reminder of that date. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation in that setting as we think about the framework of justice, equity, and compassion, and consider how that principle applies to our own individual and our congregational lives.